Most people think the empath's lowest moment was a failure, a collapse, a sign that they were too soft for a hard world, but that interpretation is shallow and wrong. What actually happened was compression, and compression is not the opposite of power, it's the condition that creates it. For a long time, the empath lived with their emotional borders wide open. They felt what others felt, often before those people even understood it themselves. They sensed tension in rooms, shifts in tone, unspoken disappointments, and because they could feel it, they responded to it. They adjusted, they softened, they carried. That sensitivity made them useful, valued, even admired, but it also made them vulnerable to a quiet form of erosion. Psychologically, this is where the problem begins. When empathy becomes your identity, you start measuring your worth by how much emotional weight you can hold without dropping it. You pride yourself on being the one who understands, the one who stays calm, the one who doesn't leave. Over time, you confuse endurance with strength. You don't realize that every time you override your own discomfort to keep the peace, you're training your nervous system to ignore its own warning signals. So the empath doesn't break suddenly. They compress slowly. It looks like exhaustion, but it's deeper than that. It's the accumulation of unprocessed resentment, unmet needs, and suppressed anger. It's the cost of constantly regulating other people's emotions while neglecting your own, and eventually the system reaches capacity. The body says no before the mind is ready to admit it. Motivation drops, joy dulls, relationships feel heavy. The empath begins to withdraw not because they don't care, but because caring has become unsustainable. This is the moment most people misunderstand. They assume the empath has lost their edge, their warmth, their gift. But what's actually happening is a forced reorganization. The psyche is doing what it always does under pressure, adapting to survive. Pressure creates structure. Without pressure, there is no reason to change. And the empath's collapse was the pressure required to expose a dangerous belief they'd been living under, that being good meant being endlessly available, that being loving meant being self-sacrificing, that boundaries were selfish and silence was failure. Once that belief cracks, everything changes. The empath begins to see patterns they couldn't see before, not because they weren't intelligent, but because awareness requires distance. They recognize how often they overextended themselves for people who never intended to reciprocate, how frequently they explained their feelings to those committed to misunderstanding them, how often they stayed in environments that benefited from their softness but offered no protection in return. This realization is painful, but it's also clarifying. It marks the end of naivete, and this is where the comeback quietly begins. Instead of asking, "How can I help?" the empath starts asking, "What is this costing me?" Instead of absorbing emotional chaos, they observe it. Instead of reflexively fixing, they pause. These pauses may feel uncomfortable at first. Guilt surfaces, old conditioning protests. But over time, something stabilizes. The nervous system recalibrates. The empath learns that they can feel deeply without drowning. Philosophically, this is a shift from identification to sovereignty. The empath no longer confuses their ability to feel with an obligation to act. They realize empathy is information, not instruction. Feeling someone's pain doesn't mean you're responsible for resolving it. Understanding someone's struggle doesn't mean you must abandon yourself to accommodate it. This distinction is subtle, but life-altering, because once the empath internalizes it, their sensitivity stops being a liability. It becomes precision. They still perceive nuance, still read energy, still understand complexity. But now that understanding is filtered through self-respect, through limits, through discernment. The collapse forced this lesson, not gently, but effectively. And that's why this stage often feels lonely. The empath is no longer who they were, but not yet who they're becoming. Old dynamics no longer work. Old roles feel wrong. People who benefited from their overgiving may pull away or push back. That's not accidental. It's diagnostic. It reveals who was attached to the empath's presence and who was attached to their availability. But the empath doesn't argue with this anymore. They don't chase validation. They don't explain their transformation. They let the distance do its work. Psychologically, this is integration. The empath is bringing strength online without killing sensitivity. They're learning to hold themselves with the same care they once reserved exclusively for others. and that internal shift creates an external calm. Not passivity calm, the kind that comes from alignment rather than compliance. This is why the comeback isn't dramatic. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's visible in how the empath responds or doesn't, in what they tolerate or refuse, in how they move through the world with less urgency to prove their goodness. They are no longer collapsing under pressure because they've learned how to distribute it. They've learned that strength isn't the absence of feeling, it's the ability to feel without losing yourself. And once an empath learns that, they don't return to who they were before the breakdown. That version couldn't survive what this one understands. They emerge quieter but clearer, softer but sturdier, less reactive, more rooted. The collapse didn't end them, it organized them. And the moment you realize your lowest point was actually the moment your life demanded a stronger structure, that's the moment you stop seeing your sensitivity as the problem and start recognizing it as the foundation of your power. After the collapse, something subtle but irreversible happens. The empath doesn't come back louder. They come back clearer. And this is where most people misread them because we're conditioned to associate growth with intensity, strong opinions, big declarations, visible confidence. But the empath's return doesn't announce itself that way. It arrives quietly through restraint. They're still kind. That hasn't changed. What has changed is access. Before, the empath's presence was open-ended. Anyone could step into their emotional space, unload, linger, and leave without consequence. Now there is a threshold, not a wall, but a gate. And that gate is controlled by discernment, not guilt. This is the first sign of real strength, the ability to choose rather than react. Psychologically, this shift is enormous. The empath has learned that boundaries are not punishments, they are filters. They don't exist to keep good people out, but to prevent the wrong dynamics from taking root. And once this understanding settles into the nervous system, the empath stops explaining themselves. Explanation was always a form of self-defense. Boundaries make explanation unnecessary. You can feel the difference in how they move through conversations. They listen, but they don't absorb. They respond, but they don't overextend. They notice manipulation faster, not because they're suspicious, but because they're regulated. A calm nervous system is a perceptive one. When you're no longer flooded by other people's emotions, patterns become obvious. This is why emotionally immature people struggle with the empath's return. The old version could be pulled into chaos. The new version does not take the bait. They pause. They ask fewer questions. They allow silence to do the work that words used to do. And silence, when paired with self-respect, is incredibly clarifying. Philosophically, this is the shift from empathy as obligation to empathy as choice. The empath no longer believes that understanding someone requires enduring them. Compassion doesn't mean proximity. Care doesn't mean compliance. These distinctions sound simple, but they take years of lived experience to fully internalize. And once they are internalized, the empath becomes unavailable for emotional exploitation. Not hardened, not cold, unavailable. There's a difference. Hardened people close themselves off because they're afraid to feel. The evolved empath remains open, but selectively. They don't numb themselves to survive. They regulate themselves to stay present. This allows them to engage deeply without being consumed. You'll notice it in how they handle conflict. There's no escalation, no over-justifying, no need to win. They state what's true for them and let the outcome unfold. This calm isn't indifference, it's confidence. The confidence that comes from knowing you can walk away without losing yourself. And here's the paradox: this version of the empath is more magnetic than the old one ever was, because stability is attractive. Emotional self-sufficiency changes the way people respond to you. Some lean in with respect, others fall away in frustration. Both reactions are information. The empath no longer chases either, they observe. This is where sovereignty shows up in practical terms. The empath chooses relationships that are reciprocal, not performative. They invest where there is effort, not entitlement. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy or familiarity with safety. These distinctions protect their energy and refine their connections. What's left is depth without chaos. People feel safer around this empath, but they also sense a limit. Not everyone gets access, not every story gets attention, not every emotional emergency becomes their responsibility. This doesn't make the empath less caring, it makes their care sustainable, and sustainability is the real comeback, because the old version burned brightly and burned out. The new version burns steadily. They understand that their sensitivity is not a resource to be mined, it's a system to be managed. They protect their rest, they honor their intuition, they take themselves seriously even when others don't. This is why the empaths return